The morning sun filtered through the worn lace curtains of Helen Thompson's small apartment, casting gentle patterns across her living room. At 78, Helen had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of her days, a cup of tea at her window seat, watching the neighborhood come alive, then perhaps some reading or a short walk to the corner store if her arthritis wasn't flaring up too badly. Today started like any other Tuesday. She shuffled from her bedroom in her faded blue slippers, the ones her granddaughter Lucy had given her 3 Christmases ago. The kettle was just beginning to whistle when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the peaceful morning silence. Helen hesitated. Nobody called her landline anymore except telemarketers and the occasional wrong number. Her daughter Beth usually texted first before calling her cell phone. Curiosity won out and she picked up the receiver. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson." The voice on the other end was bright, enthusiastic, and immediately set Helen on edge. It belonged to a young woman who introduced herself as Vanessa, a producer for a television show called America Laughs. "We've heard wonderful things about your piano playing from the community center," Vanessa continued, her words tumbling out rapidly. "We're doing a special segment on hidden talents and we'd love to have you come on the show." Helen's brow furrowed. She did occasionally play the old upright piano at the Golden Years Community Center when they had their monthly socials, but nothing special, just simple tunes that the other seniors could sing along to. She couldn't imagine who would have mentioned her to a TV show. "There must be some mistake," Helen said slowly. "I just play a little for fun. Nothing worth putting on television." "No mistake at all," Vanessa insisted. "Our researchers were very impressed, and we're looking for real people with authentic talents, not professionals. The audience loves that." Helen listened as Vanessa explained more about the show, the filming date next week, and the transportation they would provide. What caught her attention, though, was the casual mention of an appearance fee, $500 for just one afternoon of filming. The kettle had long stopped whistling, but Helen had forgotten about her tea. $500. Her mind immediately went to the stack of medical bills on her kitchen table. The new prescription for her blood pressure medication had nearly doubled in price this month, and the property taxes on her little apartment were due soon. Her late husband Tom's pension only stretched so far. "Are you still there, Mrs. Thompson?" Vanessa's voice broke through her thoughts. Yes, I'm here," Helen replied. "I'm just surprised, that's all. I haven't performed for anyone except my friends at the center in years. That's exactly what makes you perfect for our show. Real people, real talents. The audience will love you." Something in Vanessa's tone didn't quite ring true, but Helen pushed the doubt aside. $500 would cover her medication for the next 3 months. She couldn't afford to pass that up. "Well, I suppose I could give it a try," she said finally. "Wonderful." Vanessa's excitement seemed to burst through the phone. "I'll email you all the details right away." "Oh, you do have email, don't you?" Helen bit back a retort about not being completely out of touch with the modern world. "Yes, I have email. My daughter set it up for me." After providing her email address and confirming a few more details, Helen hung up the phone and finally returned to her now cold kettle. As she reheated the water for her delayed morning tea, a mixture of excitement and apprehension fluttered in her stomach. Later that afternoon, Helen called her daughter Beth to share the news. "A TV show? Mom, are you sure this is legitimate?" Beth's concern was evident even over the phone. "They're sending a car to pick me up and everything," Helen explained, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "And the show is real. I looked it up online like you taught me." Beth remained skeptical. "What's the name of this show again?" "America Laughs. It's a variety show with different segments. They said they do talent features all the time." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. "Mom, I've seen that show. Well, sometimes they can be a bit mean-spirited with their humor." Helen's heart sank a little. "What do you mean?" Beth sighed. "Just be careful, okay? Make sure you understand exactly what you're agreeing to before you go on camera." Despite her daughter's concerns, Helen couldn't shake the thought of that appearance fee. The next day, she found herself digging through the old trunk in her spare room, looking for sheet music she hadn't touched in years. Her fingers, knotted with arthritis, struggled to turn the yellowed pages. She had once been quite good, back when dreams of becoming a serious pianist still seemed possible. Life had taken her in different directions. Marriage to Tom, raising Beth, the secretarial job she'd held for 30 years to help make ends meet. The piano had become just a hobby, something to enjoy in stolen moments between responsibilities. Helen made her way to the small upright piano in the corner of her living room. It was out of tune but still playable. She placed her hands on the keys, wincing slightly at the stiffness in her joints, and began to play a simple melody she remembered from her youth. The notes came back to her slowly at first, then with increasing confidence. For an hour she practiced, surprised at how much her body remembered even as her mind struggled to recall certain passages. By the end, her fingers ached, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. Over the next few days, Helen spent more and more time at the piano. If she was going to be on television, she wanted to play something worthwhile. Not too complicated. Her fingers couldn't manage the difficult pieces anymore, but something beautiful. Something that mattered. The week passed quickly. Helen settled on a piece she thought she could manage, a simplified version of a Chopin nocturne that had always moved her. She practiced until her fingers could find the keys almost without her having to look. The night before the filming, Helen could barely sleep. Excitement and nervousness kept her tossing and turning. What if she made a mistake? What if she embarrassed herself on national television? But underneath those worries lay a deeper fear she couldn't quite name. Something about Vanessa's too enthusiastic voice, the vague explanations about how they'd heard of her playing, Beth's warning about the show's reputation. Morning came, and Helen dressed carefully in her best outfit, a powder blue dress she saved for special occasions in church, with a pearl necklace Tom had given her on their 30th anniversary. She styled her white hair with extra care, and even applied a touch of lipstick, something she rarely bothered with these days. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. A young man in a company polo shirt stood outside, keys in hand. "Mrs. Thompson? I'm Ryan, here to take you to the studio for America Laughs." The drive took nearly an hour, heading into the city where the television studio was located. Ryan was polite but didn't say much, focusing on navigating the increasingly heavy traffic. Helen watched the scenery change from residential neighborhoods to the bustling downtown area, her nervousness growing with each mile. The studio building was larger than she had imagined, all glass and steel. Inside, it was a maze of corridors and rooms filled with equipment she didn't recognize. People rushed past, barely sparing her a glance, everyone seemingly in a hurry. Ryan handed her off to a harried-looking young woman with a clipboard who introduced herself as Jen, a production assistant. Jen led Helen to a small waiting room and told her someone would be with her shortly to explain the process and take her to makeup. Left alone, Helen perched on the edge of an uncomfortable modern chair, clutching her handbag tightly. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices and occasional bursts of laughter from neighboring rooms. After 20 minutes of waiting, the door finally opened. A man with spiky hair and fashionable glasses strode in, followed by a woman Helen recognized as Vanessa from her voice. "Mrs. Thompson, so glad you could make it," Vanessa said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "This is Greg, our segment director." Greg barely looked up from his phone. "Yeah, hi. Makeup is running behind, so we need to go through the segment plan quickly." "Segment plan?" Helen asked, her confusion evident. "Yes, just the format of how we'll introduce you and your performance," Vanessa explained quickly. "The segment is called Hidden Talents, with a question mark because the audience doesn't know what to expect." Greg finally pocketed his phone. "Here's how it works. The host will call you out, chat with you for a minute about your background, then invite you to play. Simple." Something in his dismissive tone made Helen uneasy. And people really want to hear an old woman play the piano? Greg and Vanessa exchanged a quick glance that Helen couldn't quite interpret. "Our audience loves seeing people share their passions," Vanessa said smoothly, "especially people who might not fit the usual stereotype of a performer." Before Helen could ask more questions, the door opened again, and another assistant appeared to take her to the makeup department. As she was led away, she glanced back to see Greg and Vanessa with their heads together, speaking in low voices, smiles playing at the corners of their mouths. In the makeup chair, facing a mirror surrounded by bright lights, Helen caught fragments of conversation from the crew members behind her. "Is she the one for the hidden talents bit? Yeah, should be good for a few laughs." "Did they tell her what the segment is really about?" A cold feeling settled in Helen's stomach. Something wasn't right here, but before she could gather her thoughts to ask questions, She was whisked out of makeup and led toward the stage area. In the wings, waiting for her cue, Helen could see monitors showing the live studio audience and the host, a handsome man in his 30s known for his quick wit and sometimes caustic humor. The knot in her stomach tightened as she realized that this might not be the respectful showcase of talent she had been led to believe. Beth's warning echoed in her mind. Sometimes they can be a bit mean-spirited with their humor, but it was too late to back out now. And she still needed that appearance fee. As the stagehand signaled that they were almost ready for her, Helen straightened her back, lifted her chin, and took a deep breath. Whatever their intentions might be, she still had her dignity. And more importantly, she still had music, the one constant companion throughout her long life. Through joy and heartbreak, triumph and loss, they might be expecting a fumbling old woman they could laugh at. She would show them something else entirely. The bright studio lights beat down on Helen as she stood in the wings waiting for her cue. Someone had pinned a small microphone to the collar of her powder blue dress, the wire snaking down her back and disappearing into a pack that they'd clipped to her waistband. It felt foreign and uncomfortable like everything else about this place. "You'll be on after the commercial break," a young man with a headset told her, not quite meeting her eyes. "Just wait for Ted to call your name, then walk out to center stage. There's an X marked on the floor. Stand there for the introduction." Helen nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see the audience, rows and rows of people, more than she'd ever performed for in her life. Even back in high school, when she'd played at the graduation ceremony, there couldn't have been more than a few hundred people. Here, there must be at least 500, all waiting to be entertained. The floor manager's countdown began. Back from commercial in 5, 4. He continued silently with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. The studio audience applauded as Ted, the show's host, bounded back onto the stage with practiced energy. He was tall and handsome in the conventional TV way, with perfect teeth and hair that didn't move despite his animated gestures. Welcome back to America Laughs, folks. Up next, we have a very special segment that's become a fan favorite. Hidden talents? Ted emphasized the question mark with exaggerated doubt in his voice, drawing knowing chuckles from the audience. Helen's heart sank. There it was again, that question mark, the hint of mockery she'd picked up from the producers earlier. For the first time, she considered simply walking away, appearance fee or no, but where would that leave her? The medical bills wouldn't pay themselves, and the studio might even bill her for wasting their time and resources. Today's hidden talent comes to us from the great state of Massachusetts, Ted continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. She's 78 years young and claims she can play the piano. Let's see if her fingers can still find the right keys. Please welcome Helen Thompson. The audience's applause seemed tinged with anticipation of something awkward or amusing. Helen took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped out onto the stage. The lights were even brighter than she'd imagined, momentarily blinding her. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust, aware that her hesitation probably looked like confusion to the audience. Someone snickered from the front row. "There she is," Ted exclaimed, bouncing over to take her arm. His grip was firm, almost steering her toward the X on the floor. "Welcome to the show, Helen. How are you feeling today?" "I'm fine, thank you," Helen said, her voice coming out steadier than she expected. Great, great," Ted nodded, barely listening. "So I understand you play the piano? Been playing long?" "Since I was a child," Helen replied. "About 70 years now." 70 years, Ted repeated with exaggerated amazement. "That's longer than I've been alive. Twice as long, in fact." He turned to the audience with a wink. "Though looking at my gray hairs lately, you might not know it." The audience laughed on cue, and Ted continued his routine. "Tell me, Helen, what will you be playing for us today?" "A nocturne by Chopin," she said. "A simplified version," she added quickly, not wanting to overpromise. "Chopin." Ted raised his eyebrows at the audience. "Fancy." And here I was expecting chopsticks. More laughter followed, louder this time. Helen felt heat rising in her cheeks. The mockery was becoming more obvious with each passing moment. Ted was setting her up to fail, preparing the audience to laugh at an old woman fumbling at the piano keys. "Well, let's see what you've got," Ted said, gesturing toward the grand piano that stood at the center of the stage. It was a beautiful instrument, far better than her old upright at home or the worn piano at the community center. Under different circumstances, she would have been thrilled to play it. As Helen made her way to the piano, she was acutely aware of the cameras following her, probably zooming in on her slightly stooped posture, her careful steps, the way her hands trembled slightly with both nerves and arthritis. The walk felt endless, each step an opportunity for ridicule. Behind her, she heard Ted making a joke about hoping the piano bench could support her weight, followed by muffled laughter. The humiliation burned inside her, but she kept moving forward one step at a time. Finally reaching the piano, Helen carefully settled onto the bench, adjusting its height with the lever underneath. She could hear whispering and giggling from the audience as she took her time getting comfortable. A camera operator moved in close, probably hoping to capture any signs of confusion or incompetence. Helen placed her hands on the keys, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingertips. For a moment, all her doubts and fears melted away. This, at least, was familiar territory. Whatever happened next, she would have this moment with the music. Ted's voice broke through her thoughts. "Ready when you are, Helen. No rush, we've got all day." The fake cheerfulness in his tone couldn't mask the condescension. Helen ignored him, focusing instead on the keyboard before her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The piece she had chosen was one she had loved since childhood, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, though a slightly simplified arrangement that her arthritic hands could manage. She began to play, her fingers moving tentatively at first. The opening notes drifted out across the suddenly quiet studio. Helen was vaguely aware of a few titters from the audience, probably reacting to her initial hesitation, but as she continued, muscle memory took over and her confidence grew. The beautiful melody filled the space, each note clear and resonant on the perfectly tuned grand piano. Helen closed her eyes, letting the music guide her. She had played this piece so many times over the years. At her wedding reception, for Tom on their anniversaries, for Beth when she was small and couldn't sleep. The familiar pattern of notes was woven into the fabric of her life. After about 30 seconds, Helen realized that the studio had fallen completely silent. No laughter, no whispering, not even the usual shuffling and coughing of a large audience. She dared not open her eyes to look, afraid of breaking the spell, of letting her concentration slip. Instead, she leaned further into the music, adding subtle, dynamic changes that brought the nocturne to life. Her fingers, stiff and painful in everyday tasks, moved with surprising grace across the keys, finding the notes with unerring accuracy. The music swelled and receded, telling its story of gentle melancholy and quiet beauty. As she approached the middle section, where the piece grew more complex, Helen felt a momentary flutter of doubt. This was where she sometimes made mistakes during practice. But something about the perfect piano, the hushed attention of the audience, and perhaps the anger still simmering inside her at being set up for mockery, gave her hands a strength and precision they hadn't possessed in years. The difficult passage flowed effortlessly from her fingers, each note in its perfect place, each phrase shaped with the sensitivity of someone who truly understood the music. This wasn't just technically correct playing, it was artistry. Helen could sense the shift in the room. The atmosphere had changed from anticipatory mockery to genuine appreciation. No one had expected this level of skill from the elderly woman, who had been brought on as a joke. She allowed herself a small smile as she continued playing, approaching the final section of the piece. The conclusion of the nocturne was gentle and reflective, gradually becoming quieter until the final notes seemed to float away into silence. Helen held the last chord, letting it linger in the air before finally lifting her hands from the keys. For a moment, there was absolute silence in the studio. Helen opened her eyes at last, uncertain what to expect. Ted stood at the side of the stage, his mouth slightly open, all traces of his smug smile gone. The camera operators had forgotten their instructions to focus on any mistakes and were simply staring at her. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, then building rapidly into thunderous appreciation. It wasn't the polite, sympathetic applause given to someone who has tried their best despite limitations. This was genuine admiration, the kind of response usually reserved for true talent. Helen sat motionless on the bench, overwhelmed by the reaction. This wasn't what she had expected, wasn't what any of them had expected. She had come here prepared for humiliation, for being the butt of cruel jokes. Instead, she had silenced her would-be mockers with the beauty of her playing. As the applause continued, Ted finally recovered his professional composure and approached the piano. The cameras followed him, capturing his slightly flustered expression. "Helen," he said, his voice notably different from before, the mocking tone replaced with what sounded like genuine respect. "That was extraordinary. I don't think any of us expected such a beautiful performance." Helen looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think you did." There was an awkward pause as Ted registered the gentle rebuke in her words. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, clearly trying to recover the interview. Helen turned slightly on the bench to face the audience. "I studied at the music conservatory when I was young," she explained. "I wanted to be a concert pianist once. Life took me in different directions, but I never stopped playing." "Well, I think we can all agree that you could have had that career," Ted said, gesturing toward the still applauding audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear it once more for the incredible Helen Thompson." The applause redoubled, and someone in the back row stood up. Others followed suit, until the entire audience was on their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. Helen felt tears pricking at her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had really listened to her play, had recognized the skill and passion she still possessed despite her age and physical limitations. For decades, she had been just Tom's widow or Beth's mother or that nice old lady from apartment 3B. Now, suddenly she was Helen Thompson, pianist, seen and appreciated for who she truly was. As she finally rose from the piano bench, acknowledging the applause with a small, dignified bow, Helen caught sight of the producers standing in the wings. Vanessa and Greg were watching with identical expressions of shock, their plans for a comedy segment thoroughly derailed by her unexpected talent. Helen smiled to herself as Ted escorted her center stage. Whatever they had intended to happen today, she had changed the script entirely, and judging by the audience's reaction, no one was complaining about the plot twist. The applause followed Helen all the way off the stage. She could still hear it echoing behind her as a stagehand guided her through the wings and into a small green room. Her heart was racing, partly from the performance and partly from the unexpected reaction it had received. "That was amazing," the young stagehand said, his earlier indifference completely gone. "I've worked on this show for 2 seasons and I've never heard the audience respond like that." Helen smiled, still too overwhelmed to speak. Her hands were trembling now, the adrenaline wearing off and the reality of what had just happened beginning to sink in. She had been brought onto the show as a joke, expected to fumble and fail for the audience's amusement. Instead, she had shown them all that age hadn't diminished her talent, only added depth to her interpretation. The door to the green room burst open and Vanessa rushed in, her clipboard clutched to her chest and her expression a mixture of shock and calculation. "Mrs. Thompson," she began, her voice breathless. "That was unexpected." Helen looked at her steadily. "Was it?" Vanessa had the grace to look embarrassed. "I mean, we knew you played, but not at that level." "The audience loved you." "Did they?" "I thought they were expecting something else entirely." Helen's voice was calm, but there was a steely edge to it that made Vanessa shift uncomfortably. "Well, the thing about America Laughs is that we're always looking for surprises," Vanessa said, recovering her professional smoothness. "And you certainly delivered one." Before Helen could respond, the door opened again and Ted walked in, followed by a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit whom Helen didn't recognize. "Helen, phenomenal performance," Ted said, his earlier mockery replaced with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "I want you to meet someone. This is Richard Klein, our executive producer." Richard stepped forward, extending his hand. "Mrs. Thompson, I can't tell you how impressed we all were. You've just turned what was supposed to be a 3-minute segment into the highlight of our entire season." Helen shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calculating look in his eyes that matched Vanessa's. These were people who saw opportunity everywhere, even in their own mistakes. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'm glad I could entertain your audience." "Entertain? You move them to tears," Richard said. "We've already got the clip ready for social media, and I'm willing to bet it goes viral by tonight." The thought of her performance being shared online with thousands, perhaps millions, of strangers made Helen feel suddenly vulnerable. She had come here for the appearance fee, not for fame. All she wanted now was to go home, take some aspirin for her aching hands, and process what had happened in the quiet of her own apartment. As if reading her mind, Richard continued. Now we'd like to discuss the possibility of a follow-up appearance. The audience will want to hear your story, how you learned to play, why you never pursued it professionally. We could do a whole special segment next week. Helen hesitated. The idea of coming back to this place, of being on camera again, made her stomach tighten with anxiety. But then she thought of her medical bills, of the repairs her apartment needed, of how long it had been since she'd been able to buy new clothes or treat herself to dinner at a nice restaurant. A second appearance would mean another fee, perhaps even a larger one given how well the first had gone. I'll need to think about it, she said finally. This has all been quite overwhelming. Richard nodded, though she could tell he wasn't used to people not jumping at his offers. Of course. Vanessa will give you my card. Call me directly when you decide. After a few more minutes of conversation, during which Helen was given a bottle of water and her appearance fee, in cash, in an envelope as promised, she was finally escorted back to the waiting car. Ryan, the driver who had brought her to the studio, seemed different now, more attentive, almost respectful. That was something else, Mrs. Thompson, he said as he held the car door open for her. My mom called me while you were playing. She was watching the show live and couldn't believe what she was seeing. Your mother watches the show? Helen asked, settling into the back seat. Ryan nodded as he got behind the wheel. Every week. She loves Ted. Thinks he's hilarious. He paused, then added, She said what they tried to do to you wasn't right, but you showed them. So it had been obvious to the viewers at home, too. The setup, the intended humiliation. Helen felt a flush of retrospective anger, but it was tempered by the satisfaction of having subverted their expectations so completely. The drive back to her apartment was quiet. Helen lost in thought as the city scenery gradually gave way to the familiar sights of her neighborhood. By the time Ryan pulled up in front of her building, she was exhausted, the emotional and physical toll of the day catching up with her. Thank you for the ride, she said as he came around to open her door. My pleasure, Mrs. Thompson, he replied, and she could tell he meant it. For what it's worth, my grandmother was a music teacher for 40 years. She would have loved your playing. Helen smiled, touched by the personal connection. Thank you. That means a lot. As she made her way up to her apartment, she could feel curious eyes on her. Mrs. Patel from across the hall was watering the plants outside her door, and she looked up as Helen approached. I saw you on the television, Mrs. Patel exclaimed. My daughter called and told me to turn it on right away. You are magnificent. You saw it? Helen asked, surprised at how quickly word had spread. Everyone saw it. It's all over the Facebook already. My grandson showed me on his phone. Helen fumbled with her keys, suddenly eager to get inside her apartment and process this new information. Social media. Richard had mentioned it would likely go viral, but she hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. Once inside, she headed straight for the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands were still aching from the intensity of her playing. It had been years since she'd performed a piece all the way through with such focus and emotion. The old upright in her living room seemed to watch her reproachfully, as if to ask why it hadn't been the recipient of such dedication lately. Just as she was about to sit down and rest, her cell phone rang. It was Beth, Mom. Her daughter's voice was a mixture of amazement and concern. Are you okay? I just saw a clip of you on the show. Why didn't you tell me you were going on today? I didn't want you to worry, Helen admitted. And after what you said about the show sometimes being mean-spirited, I was afraid you'd try to talk me out of it. Well, I would have, Beth said. Mom, that show is notorious for humiliating people. When I saw you walk out on that stage, my heart nearly stopped. But then, Mom, you were incredible. I had no idea you could still play like that. The still stung a little, but Helen let it pass. Neither did I, to be honest. I think I was running on pure adrenaline, and maybe a bit of anger at being set up as a joke. You certainly showed them, Beth said, and Helen could hear the pride in her voice. Listen, I'm coming over. This is too big to discuss over the phone, and I want to make sure you're really okay. After hanging up, Helen finally allowed herself to sink into her favorite armchair. The events of the day washed over her in waves. The nervousness, the humiliation, the triumph, and now the aftermath. She had gone to the studio as an elderly woman desperate for a small appearance fee. She had come home as, what, a viral sensation? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Lucy, her granddaughter. "Grandma, you're famous. Everyone at school is talking about you." Then another message arrived, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Thompson, this is David Chen from the Boston Globe. We'd love to interview you about your performance today. Please call me at your convenience." And another. "Helen, it's Richard Klein again. The clip has hit 100,000 views in under an hour. We need to talk about next steps. Call me." Helen set the phone down, her head spinning. This wasn't what she had expected when she agreed to appear on America Laughs. She had simply needed the money, had been willing to endure a little embarrassment to get it. Instead, she had accidentally launched herself into a spotlight she had never sought. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Beth standing there, eyes wide with excitement. "Mom," she said, holding up her phone. "You're trending." Helen shook her head, not fully understanding. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means thousands of people are sharing the video of your performance and talking about it online." The show posted the clip with the caption, "Elderly woman shocks audience with hidden talent." And it's exploded. Beth stepped inside, looking around the familiar apartment as if seeing it for the first time. The worn furniture, the faded curtains, the old upright piano in the corner that had seemed like such a splurge when Tom bought it for her 40th birthday. "The comments are amazing," Beth continued, scrolling through her phone. "People are saying you should have been a professional pianist, asking why you never pursued it, wondering if you give lessons." "Lessons?" Helen repeated, incredulous. "I haven't given a piano lesson since you were in middle school." "Well, people are asking. And not just about lessons. There's a comment here from someone claiming to be from the Boston Symphony Orchestra, inviting you to attend their next performance as a special guest." Helen sank back into her armchair, feeling overwhelmed all over again. "I don't understand why people are so interested. I just played a simple piece." Beth sat down across from her, her expression softening. "Mom, it wasn't just what you played, it was how you played it. And it was the contrast between what everyone expected and what you delivered. People love that kind of story. The underestimated elderly person who proves everyone wrong." Helen winced at the word elderly, though she knew it was accurate. At 78, she was well past what most would consider old age. But inside, she didn't feel elderly, especially not when she was playing the piano. The music made her ageless, connecting her to the girl she had been, the woman she had become, and the artist she had always, in her heart, remained. "So what happens now?" she asked, more to herself than to Beth. "That depends," her daughter replied. "What do you want to happen? You could just let this moment pass, enjoy the brief fame, and go back to your normal life, or, Helen prompted when Beth trailed off. "Or you could see where this takes you. The show wants you back. The newspaper wants to interview you. Who knows what other opportunities might come from this?" Helen glanced at the piano, its dark wood gleaming in the late afternoon sunlight. For so many years it had been just a piece of furniture, a reminder of dreams deferred. Now suddenly it seemed like a doorway to possibilities she had long ago stopped considering. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is all happening so fast." Beth nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course. But Mom, whatever you decide, I want you to know I'm proud of you. Not just for how beautifully you played, but for how you handled yourself in a situation designed to humiliate you. You showed incredible dignity." Helen smiled, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you, dear. That means more than all those views and comments." As Beth went to the kitchen to make them both some tea, Helen's gaze remained fixed on the piano. The day had begun with her being seen as just another old woman, someone to be mocked for entertainment. It was ending with her being recognized for who she truly was, a musician whose passion and skill had remained intact despite the passing years. Whatever came next, that recognition alone felt like a victory long overdue. The next morning, Helen woke to the sound of her phone ringing. She had silenced it the night before after the constant notifications had become too much, but calls from her favorite contacts would still come through. This time it was Lucy, her granddaughter. "Grandma, have you seen how many views you have now?" Lucy's excited voice carried through the speaker without waiting for a greeting. Helen sat up slowly, reaching for her glasses on the nightstand. "Good morning to you too, dear." "No, I haven't checked since last night." 3 million, Grandma, 3 million. You're more famous than my favorite YouTuber." The number was so large that Helen couldn't quite grasp it. 3 million people had watched her play the piano. It seemed impossible. Just 2 days ago, her audience had been limited to the other residents at the Golden Years Community Center, most of whom dozed through her monthly performances. That's a lot of people, she said finally. It's huge. And guess what? Someone created a fan page for you on Instagram. It already has 50,000 followers. Helen sighed. The digital world moved too fast for her to keep up with. Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. These were all platforms Lucy had tried to explain to her over the years, but Helen had never seen the point of joining. Now apparently she had a presence on them whether she wanted it or not. Lucy, I need to get dressed and have my tea. Can I call you back later? After hanging up, Helen moved slowly around her apartment, going through her morning routine with deliberate care. Her hands were still sore from yesterday's playing, the arthritis aggravated by the unusual exertion. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she glanced at her phone and saw that she had 17 missed calls, 32 text messages, and over 100 email notifications. Most were from numbers and addresses she didn't recognize. The kettle whistled, and Helen gratefully turned her attention to making tea. The familiar ritual, warming the pot, measuring the loose leaves, pouring the water, helped ground her in normality when everything else seemed to be spinning out of control. A knock at the door interrupted her first sip. Peering through the peephole, she was surprised to see Mrs. Patel from across the hall, along with 2 other neighbors from her floor. "Helen, we brought breakfast," Mrs. Patel announced when she opened the door. "We thought you might not want to go out today with all the excitement." The trio bustled in, bearing bags of fresh bagels, cream cheese, and fruit. Helen was touched by their thoughtfulness, though slightly overwhelmed by the sudden invasion of her quiet morning. "The building manager says there have been reporters asking for you downstairs," said Mr. Reynolds, a retired postal worker from apartment 4C. "He's been turning them away, but they're persistent." "Reporters?" Helen echoed. "Here?" Mrs. Patel nodded vigorously. "Oh yes, and not just local ones. Someone from a national morning show came by as well." Helen sank into a chair at her small kitchen table. This was moving too fast. She had enjoyed her moment of recognition, the satisfaction of proving the mockery wrong, but she hadn't signed up for this level of attention. "What should I do?" she asked, more to herself than to her neighbors. "Enjoy it," Mrs. Patel said immediately. "How often does someone our age get to be a celebrity?" Mr. Reynolds was more cautious. "You might want to get someone to help you manage all this. A lawyer maybe, or an agent." The word agent made Helen laugh despite her anxiety. "An agent at my age? For playing one piece of music on a TV show?" "Don't underestimate what you did," said the third neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly arranging the bagels on a plate. "You showed the world that talent doesn't disappear with age." That's a powerful message. After her neighbors left, promising to keep an eye out for more reporters, Helen finally checked her email. Among the flood of messages from strangers, one caught her eye, from the director of the Golden Years Community Center, with the subject line, "Opportunity." The email was brief and to the point. A local music school had contacted the center after seeing Helen's performance, wondering if she would be interested in teaching a master class for their advanced students. They were offering a generous honorarium for a one-day workshop. Helen read the email twice, her heart beating faster. Teaching. She had done some of that years ago, mostly to supplement the family income while Beth was growing up. She had enjoyed it, found satisfaction in guiding young fingers across the keys, explaining the emotional heart of a piece rather than just the technical aspects. Before she could overthink it, she replied with a simple, "Yes, I would be interested. Please provide more details." Her phone rang almost immediately after she hit send. It was Richard Klein from the show. "Mrs. Thompson," he began without preamble, "we need to get you back in the studio as soon as possible. The audience response has been unprecedented. We're thinking a special segment, maybe even a recurring feature. Helen's Hidden Talents or something like that." Helen frowned at his presumptuous tone. "Mr. Klein, I appreciate the offer, but I haven't decided if I want to return to your show." There was a pause, and when Richard spoke again, his voice had a new edge to it. "Mrs. Thompson, Helen, I hope you understand what an opportunity this is. Most people would kill for this kind of exposure. Most people weren't brought onto your show to be mocked," Helen replied, surprising herself with her directness. "I came for the appearance fee because I needed the money." What happened afterward was unexpected, And wonderful, Richard said quickly. A perfect television moment. The audience loved you. We can do so much more with this. Interviews, follow-up performances, maybe even a segment where you mentor other senior citizens with hidden talents. The idea was tempting in some ways. The exposure could lead to more opportunities like the one from the music school, and the money would certainly help with her ongoing financial concerns. But something about Richard's eagerness, the calculating undertone in his voice, made her hesitate. I need more time to think about it, she said finally. This has all happened very quickly. After hanging up, Helen went to her piano. The old upright had been Tom's gift to her decades ago, purchased second-hand but still a significant expense for their modest budget. Its tone wasn't as rich as the grand piano at the studio, and some of the keys stuck occasionally. But it was hers, a faithful companion through years of joy and sorrow. She placed her fingers on the keys, feeling the familiar ivory beneath her fingertips. For a moment she simply sat there, not playing, just remembering. All those years of practice as a child and teenager, the dreams of concert halls and recording contracts, the gradual adjustment to a different kind of life, marriage, motherhood, a steady job with regular hours and reliable pay. She had never regretted her choices. Tom had been a wonderful husband, Beth a joy to raise, and her work as a school secretary had been satisfying in its own way. But the music had always been there, a private passion kept alive in stolen moments between responsibilities. Now, suddenly, at 78, the passion wasn't private anymore. 3 million people had watched her play. Strangers were creating online fan pages for her. Reporters were gathering downstairs. It was overwhelming, exciting, and more than a little frightening. Her phone buzzed with a text from Beth. Mom, have you seen the morning news? They're talking about you. I'm coming over at lunch break. Helen sighed and began to play. Not Chopin this time, but a simple Bach prelude, letting the familiar patterns soothe her racing thoughts. As she played, a clarity began to emerge. She didn't want fame for fame's sake. She didn't want to be a novelty act on America Laughs or any other show. But she did want to play, really play for people who appreciated music, and perhaps if the opportunity arose to teach again, to pass on what she knew to younger generations. By the time Beth arrived with sandwiches and excited updates about Helen's growing online presence, she had made up her mind. I'm not going back on that show, she announced as they sat down to eat. At least not on their terms. Beth looked surprised. But Mom, they're offering you a platform, and I'm sure the money would be good. The money would be very good, Helen admitted, but I'd be selling myself short. They want to package me as a cute old lady who can surprisingly play the piano. I'm more than that. Of course you are, Beth agreed quickly. But what's the alternative? Helen smiled, feeling more certain with each passing moment. I've been thinking about that. The community center forwarded an offer from a music school. They want me to teach a master class. And I said yes, that's wonderful. But one class isn't exactly a career comeback. No, but it's a start. And I've been reading the other emails too. There's a request from the local classical radio station for an interview. Another from a senior living community asking if I'd give a recital for their residents. She paused, gathering her courage before sharing her biggest idea. And I've been thinking about reaching out to some of the smaller concert venues in town. Nothing grand. I'm not delusional about suddenly becoming a famous concert pianist at my age. But I could do a small recital, maybe. Tickets at a reasonable price. Beth's expression softened into something like wonder. Mom, are you serious? You'd perform in public? A real concert? Why not? Helen said, though her heart raced at the thought. I'd need to practice, of course. My repertoire is limited these days and my hands can't handle the most demanding pieces anymore. But I could put together a program of music I love and can play well. I think it's an amazing idea, Beth said, reaching across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. But what about the money? I know that's why you went on the show in the first place. Helen nodded, acknowledging the practical concern. I've been thinking about that too. If I do a recital and charge for tickets even at a modest price, that could help. And if the master class goes well, perhaps there could be more teaching opportunities. It wouldn't make me rich, but it might supplement my pension enough to cover the medical bills and home repairs. As they continued talking, Helen's phone buzzed continuously with notifications, but she ignored it. The outside world, with its sudden interest in her, would have to wait. This moment of planning with her daughter, of reimagining what her later years could look like, felt too precious to interrupt. Later, after Beth had returned to work, Helen sat at her piano again. This time, she played more deliberately, assessing which pieces she could still manage and which would require too much from her arthritic hands. She made notes on a pad beside her. Chopin nocturnes, yes. Bach preludes, definitely. Mozart sonatas, perhaps the simpler movements. Debussy, selectively. As the afternoon light filtered through her window, casting long shadows across the living room floor, Helen felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. The viral video and subsequent attention had been a shock, an unexpected disruption to her quiet life. But perhaps it had also been a gift, a reminder that it wasn't too late to reclaim a part of herself that had been set aside but never truly forgotten. She looked at the small collection of framed photos on top of the piano. Tom on their wedding day, Beth's high school graduation, Lucy's recent prom picture. She could almost imagine what Tom would say if he were here. "I always told you you were meant to play for people." Helly? He had been her biggest supporter, always encouraging her to keep her music alive even when life's demands made it difficult. With renewed determination, Helen reached for her phone. It was time to start returning some of those calls, not to Richard Klein or the reporters, but to the people offering opportunities that aligned with what she truly wanted. At 78, she was being given a second chance at a dream she had long ago filed away as impossible. She wasn't going to waste it. 6 months had passed since Helen's unexpected moment of fame on America Laughs. The crisp autumn air had given way to winter, then spring, and now summer warmth filled her apartment as she carefully selected a dress from her closet. Tonight was special. After months of preparation, practice, and smaller performances, Helen was giving her first formal recital at the Clayton Community Arts Center. The venue wasn't large, just a 200-seat auditorium, but it had a beautiful Steinway piano and excellent acoustics. More importantly, it was sold out. Helen laid the navy blue dress on her bed, smoothing out the fabric with hands that still showed the swollen joints of arthritis, but moved with more confidence now. Regular playing had actually improved her dexterity, her doctor had noted with surprise at her last checkup. The pain was still there, managed with medication and hot paraffin treatments, but the joy of making music again had made it worthwhile. Her phone chimed with a text from Beth. "The flowers are ordered, and Lucy's picked up the programs from the printer." "How are you feeling?" Helen smiled as she typed back, "Nervous but ready. See you at 6. The journey to this night had been far from straightforward. After declining Richard Klein's offers to return to America Laughs as a recurring novelty act, Helen had faced backlash from the show. They had aired a segment suggesting she was ungrateful for the platform they had given her, implying that her viral moment had been their generous gift rather than a happy accident born from their attempt to mock her. For a week or two, it had seemed like her brief fame might turn sour. Online comments questioned her motives, and a few gossip sites published unflattering stories suggesting she was difficult or had let success go to her head. Then something unexpected happened. Ted, the host who had initially set her up for ridicule, broke ranks with the show's producers. In a surprisingly candid interview with a popular podcast, he admitted that the Hidden Talents segment had often been cruel, using older people as unwitting punchlines. Helen's triumph, he said, had made him reconsider the ethics of his comedy, and her refusal to return on the show's exploitative terms had earned his respect. The interview changed the narrative. Suddenly, Helen wasn't an ungrateful senior citizen, but a principled artist standing up against ageism in entertainment. The online tide turned in her favor, with many praising her dignity and determination to chart her own course. More meaningful than the public support, though, had been the quiet opportunities that followed. The master class at the music school had gone well enough that they invited her to teach a regular workshop for advanced students. A documentary filmmaker had approached her about being featured in a project on late-in-life artistic renaissance. And most importantly, she had reconnected with other musicians her age, forming a small chamber group that performed monthly at senior living communities and hospitals. As Helen finished dressing for her recital, she thought about how much had changed since that day she answered Vanessa's phone call. Her financial situation had stabilized, Not through a windfall of TV fame, but through steady income from teaching and modestly priced performances. The medical bills were under control, and she'd even managed to set aside a small emergency fund. The doorbell rang, breaking her reverie. It was Mrs. Patel, looking elegant in a colorful silk outfit. "Ready for your big night?" her neighbor asked, stepping inside. "As ready as I'll ever be," Helen replied, feeling butterflies in her stomach despite her months of preparation. "The car service is waiting downstairs. Your daughter called to make sure I reminded you to bring your reading glasses for the music." Helen smiled, touched by Beth's attentiveness. Though she had memorized most of her program, she kept the sheet music as a security blanket, and her eyes weren't what they used to be under the stage lights. The drive to the Clayton Center was quiet, Helen using the time to mentally review her program. She had chosen pieces that spoke to different phases of her life. A Mozart sonata she had played as a teenager, a Chopin nocturne from her conservatory days, a Debussy arabesque that had been Tom's favorite, and a contemporary piece she had discovered only recently, its gentle dissonance speaking to her current stage of life. As they approached the venue, Helen was surprised to see a small crowd gathered outside. Mrs. Patel noticed her worried expression. "Don't worry. They're not reporters," she reassured Helen. "Those are your fans from the senior centers. They've been posting about your recital in their Facebook groups for weeks." Indeed, as Helen carefully made her way from the car to the stage door, several elderly patrons called out words of encouragement. "Show them what we can do, Helen," shouted a man leaning on a cane. "We're proud of you," called a woman with snow-white hair. Backstage, Beth and Lucy were waiting. Beth immediately fussed over Helen's dress and hair, while Lucy, now a high school senior, bounced with excitement. "Grandma, it's packed out there." And guess who showed up? Before Helen could ask, the stage manager approached. "Mrs. Thompson, there's a gentleman who would like to speak with you before the show. He says he's from the Boston Symphony Orchestra." Helen exchanged surprised glances with Beth. Back when her performance had first gone viral, there had indeed been a comment online from someone claiming to be from the symphony, but nothing had come of it. The gentleman who entered the green room was tall and distinguished, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm William Parker, Director of Community Outreach for the BSO. I apologize for not following up sooner after your television appearance. By the time we verified it was really you in the comments section, you had stopped responding to messages." Helen nodded, remembering how overwhelmed she had been by the flood of online attention. "There were so many I couldn't keep track." "Understandable," Mr. Parker said with a smile. "But I'm glad we found you again. The Symphony is launching a new program called Lifetime of Music that celebrates musicians who have sustained their passion and skill through decades of life. We would be honored if you would consider being part of our inaugural concert series." Beth gasped softly beside her, and Lucy squeezed her arm in excitement. Helen took a moment to absorb the offer. The Boston Symphony Orchestra was world-class, far beyond the small venues she had been playing. It wasn't a solo concert they were offering, presumably, but still, to play with professional musicians at Symphony Hall, it was beyond anything she had dared to imagine. "That's very kind," she said carefully. "What exactly would it involve?" As Mr. Parker explained the details, a special weekend of performances featuring musicians over 70, each playing a short solo piece with accompaniment from symphony members. The stage manager signaled that it was almost time for the recital to begin. "We can discuss this further after your performance," Mr. Parker said, understanding the need to table the conversation. "Break a leg, Mrs. Thompson. I look forward to hearing you play." As he left, Beth turned to Helen with wide eyes. "Mom, this is incredible." "The Boston Symphony." Helen nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions: pride, nervousness, disbelief that this was happening at her age. "Let's get through tonight first," she said. "One step at a time." The stage manager returned. 5 minutes, Mrs. Thompson." Beth and Lucy gave her quick hugs before taking their seats in the audience. Mrs. Patel squeezed her hand and whispered, "You will be magnificent," before following them out. Alone backstage, Helen took deep breaths, centering herself. 6 months ago, she had been a widow living quietly on a fixed income, playing piano occasionally for her own enjoyment. Now she was about to give a solo recital, with the possibility of performing with the Boston Symphony on the horizon. Life had taken an unexpected turn, all because she had been chosen as an object of mockery that backfired spectacularly. There was a certain poetic justice to it all. The very show that had intended to humiliate her had instead catapulted her back to her first love, performing music for appreciative audiences. Not as a gimmick or a novelty act, but as a serious musician whose age added depth to her interpretation rather than diminishing her ability. The stage manager gave her the final signal. It was time. Helen walked onto the stage, the spotlight illuminating her path to the gleaming Steinway. The applause that greeted her was warm and enthusiastic. She acknowledged it with a small bow before settling onto the bench, adjusting its height with practiced ease. Looking out at the audience, she could make out familiar faces, Beth and Lucy in the front row, Mrs. Patel and other neighbors scattered throughout, students from her master classes, fellow musicians from the chamber group, even Mr. Reynolds, who had never mentioned an interest in classical music, but had bought a ticket to support her. And there, in the third row, was a face she hadn't expected, Ted, the TV host, sitting quietly with a respectful expression. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small nod that somehow conveyed both apology and admiration. Helen placed her hands on the keys, feeling the familiar cool ivory beneath her fingers. This moment, the hush of anticipation, the perfect mechanism of the piano waiting for her touch, the connection about to be formed with the audience, this was what she had loved since childhood. The first notes of Mozart filled the hall, clear and precise. As she played, Helen felt a lifetime of experiences flowing through her music. Youthful dreams, love found and lost, the quiet joys of motherhood, the sorrows of widowhood, and now this unexpected renaissance in her final act of life. When the final piece concluded, the audience rose in a standing ovation that continued for several minutes. As Helen accepted a bouquet from Lucy and took her bows, she reflected on how differently things might have turned out if she had simply refused that initial phone call from America Laughs. She might still be struggling with medical bills, playing only for herself, her talent unrecognized beyond a small circle of friends. Instead, she had found a new purpose, reconnected with her deepest passion, and perhaps most importantly, become an inspiration to others who believed their creative days were behind them. As she left the stage to thunderous applause, Helen knew that whatever came next, whether the symphony opportunity or simply more teaching and small recitals, she had already received the greatest gift. She had been seen, truly seen, not as just an elderly woman, but as an artist whose voice still had something valuable to offer the world. In the end, what had begun as an attempt to mock her had transformed into a platform for her long-delayed recognition. The joke, as they say, had been on them. But Helen wasn't laughing at anyone's expense. She was simply playing, bringing beauty into the world one note at a time, proving that talent and passion don't diminish with age. They simply mature, like fine wine, growing richer and more complex with the passing years.